Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily rule. Today I'm going to be going through all the CR changes in the update associated with Marvel superheroes. Ready? Let's get started. There were a lot of changes this time around, but almost all of them are non-functional, or what I call semi-functional, changes that exist only to support some new card or mechanic. This time around, there were 6 new creature types, with an honorable mention for Spy, which had formerly only been on silver-bordered cards. We also got a new enchantment type in Plan and a new artifact type in Vibranium, which also has a predefined token to go with it, which is like a Power Stone but indestructible. Did they really need this to be a new token? If they were going to make Vibraniums, couldn't they have at least messed with the confusing stipulation on how you could spend the mana? If you're interested in that, by the way, check out my video on Power Stones plus Doubling Cube, where I talked about exactly what you could or could not spend this mana on. We also had a new rule to define what worthy means, and another for the newly keyworded heal, which was teased Planeswalker style in the reminder text of cards with Regenerate. And, of course, speaking of new keywords, we have Power Up and Teamwork. Neither of these is particularly crazy. Teamwork is literally just kicker, except that the additional cost is locked in to be tapping creatures with a total power of at least some given number. I think Power Up is a little bit more interesting. Here's a quick pop quiz. Do you know why Blood Rush on cards like this Robo-Belt Maka is italicized, but Power Up is not? As a hint, it's the same as the reason why the part that talks about activating the ability only once and reducing the cost if the creature entered this turn is italicized for Power-Up cards, but the part about putting +1/+1 counters is not. And for that matter, neither is the part about discarding and targeting an attacking creature on the Blood Rush cards. Now, the reason for this difference in formatting is that Magic uses italics to signify that text has no in-game significance. Blood Rush is an ability word. This means it does not have any meaning in itself. The only reason that it's on the card is to highlight that this mechanic does similar things on all the cards that it's on. In contrast, Power Up is an actual keyword, which means the word Power Up on a card encodes additional rules meaning that you need to look up in the comprehensive rules. Some Power Up cards have reminder text that summarizes what it does, but remember, italicized text is not rules text. This reminder text is only provided as a convenience. Sometimes the summary is incomplete or hand-wavy, which means the best practice is to look up the official definition of the keyword in the CR anytime you have a rules question that relies on knowing exactly what it does. Power Up in front of an activated ability has this specific meaning, and we can see that although the Power Up abilities all put +1/+1 counters on the creature, that is in no way required by the official definition of that ability, meaning that someday there could be a new Power Up card printed that did not put any counters on itself as the ability resolved. And furthermore, we can see that the counters are in no way tied to the activate only once stipulation. This means that removing the +1/+1 counters from a powered up creature will not let you power up again, nor will you be able to reactivate a creature's power up ability if the first instance of that ability got countered or otherwise did not result in any +1/+1 counters being put on that creature. Now, speaking of keywords, these keywords all had their definitions in the CR changed. Before the official CR update article was published yesterday, I spent a long time trying to figure out why. And I was correct in my evaluation that this is a non-functional change, but it turns out that all of them had previously been described as a special type or variant of an activated or other keyword ability. Supposedly, this description had some people confused because they were conflating it with special actions. I personally have a hard time picturing someone whose rules knowledge was sophisticated enough to be looking in the CR for answers like this, but also naive enough to not understand the distinction between special actions and abilities. But I also realize this could be one of those times where having a high level of experience makes it difficult to empathize with people who have lower levels of experience. And I'll never be against cleaning things up in order to make them less confusing, so I don't mind this change. Another change of questionable functionality, have a look at this rule and see if you can find that maybe it reads a little bit weird, unless that text specifies otherwise. The old version of this rule started out by saying, in card text, phrases like first main phase, etc. I'm guessing that they changed this one so that it would refer to text in rules or in game objects that were not cards, like tokens or emblems, but I have to wonder whether we'll be seeing this one in a future update article. Now for the cards and interactions that required new rules. First, let's take a look at how the throw ability on Captain America looks here. When you're announcing a division or distribution among some number of targets, each target must receive at least one of whatever is being divided. This means that the legal options for the division are dependent upon which equipment you're unattaching. There's just one problem. You don't unattach an equipment until the part of the process where you're paying the costs, which comes after when you declare targets and when you declare how the damage will be divided among them. The new rule that was introduced to resolve this issue allows you to basically pinky promise the game that you will remove an appropriate equipment and proceed as though that equipment had already been removed in order for this ability to function. Now, if you fail to do so, the activation of the ability is illegal and will be rewound, of course. A similar solution was already in place for mechanics like offering, and the explanation that I give in the video how offering works is largely applicable to the change that was made this time here too. This next change is relevant in multiplayer formats. Let's say Amy, Nick, Olive, and Pat are playing Commander, and that's the turn order. Nick attacks Amy, and then Olive attacks Nick, bringing him down to 0 and eliminating him from the game. When the game gets back around to Amy, she wants to cast Avenge. Can she do it for its discounted rate? Now, I think that we can all agree that Nick attacked Amy during his last turn, so it stands to reason that she could. Great. Well, what if several turns down the road, Amy returned that Avenge to her hand and wanted to cast it again? She argues that during the last turn that Nick took, he did indeed attack her, so it seems like she should get the discounted rate again. I think it's pretty clear that that's not how it's intended to work, so this rule got updated to tell Amy no. If the game needs information about what actions a player took during their last turn and that player's left the game since then, it can only see those actions up until the point where that player would have begun another turn. Note that this rule only applies if Nick has left the game. Effects that cause players to skip their turn or take an extra turn have no bearing on whether the game can see any game actions a player took during the last turn that they actually did take. Next up, we have a new rule that defines what it means for a vehicle to be crewed by a creature, courtesy of Balthier and Fran. It's a little weird to me that they made this into its own special rule rather than just rolling it into this other existing rule that defines what it means for a creature to crew a vehicle. And now we're on to the functional changes. These are rules that actually change how something works. All of them are relatively minor, relevant only in specific cases. So, for example, let's say you use Mnemonic Deluge to exile a Night's Whisper, but you only want to cast 2 out of the 3 copies that you get. Is this allowed? Now, based on just the printed wording, it's a little ambiguous whether you may cast the copies is supposed to be interpreted to mean that you make this decision independently for each one, or whether you're making one decision about whether you want to cast all 3 of them or none at all. Now, this new rule indicates that the former is the correct interpretation, and therefore casting only 2 of the 3 copies is indeed possible. Here's one related to reflexive triggers. Sometimes an ability will let you pay a cost multiple times and trigger when you pay the cost. If you pay the cost multiple times, the reflexive trigger does not trigger independently for each time the cost was paid. The ability generally scales with that, so having it trigger extra times on top is kind of like a double dip. The old rule that spelled this out was worded somewhat narrowly, calling out a specific template that it applied to. Hawkeye does not use this specific template, and so the wording on the rule was broadened to apply to any situation where you pay multiple times. What about if you played a Red Room Recruit, and in response to its ETB ability, your opponent plays a Lightning Bolt to kill it? Well, even though the Red Room Recruit is no longer on the battlefield at the time its ability resolves, it still is possible to perform the game instruction of having it connive, so you still do get to draw and discard a card. What about if your opponent uses an Entwined Grab the Reins to steal and sacrifice your recruit rather than just killing it with Lightning Bolt? Well, this is a little bit trickier, but it still works as most people were probably expecting. This time your opponent gets to draw and discard because that's who controlled the Red Room Recruit, the creature that's conniving, the last time it was on the battlefield. Both of these questions work exactly the same as they did previously. But what would happen if, instead of killing it, your opponent played a spell that phased Red Room Recruit out, like this Slip Out the Back? Well, the rule that covered the previous 2 examples used to be worded such that it applied only if the affected permanent changed zones before it connived. Phasing does not count as a zone change, so the wording was broadened to cover any situation where that permanent cannot be found on the battlefield, such as because it phased out. Similar changes were made to the analogous rules associated with Explore, Lifelink, Death Touch, Wither, and Infect. Connive also got a new rule clarifying that if a creature connives 0, no connive event happens, and so abilities that trigger when something connives do not trigger. And then there's one last functional change. Let's say that you play an Ixodron while there are some double-faced permanents out. You might already know that a double-faced permanent cannot be turned face down. Therefore, the double-faced permanents do not become 2/2s. See, Ixodron makes everything a 2/2 with no abilities because of this other rule, which states that if a face-up permanent is turned face down by an ability that doesn't list any characteristics, those ones that I just said are the ones that the game uses as a default. Remember that italicized text is reminder text. It doesn't do anything by itself. It's just there to remind you about this rule that's on screen now, which is what officially causes that result. But here's the thing, that rule that sets the characteristics of the thing that was turned face down is worded so that it needs to actually see the creature being turned face down in order to apply. In contrast, take a look at this cyber conversion. As you can see, unlike Ixodron, this card actually does list off a set of characteristics that will be applied to the targeted creature. Becoming a 2/2 Cyberman artifact creature is thus part of the effect of turning that creature face down. This is weird because it's not like how, for example, Lifecraft Awakening works. With that card, the first step in its resolution is for you to put a +1/+1 counters on the artifact, and then the next step is to set up a continuous effect that makes that artifact a 0/0 construct artifact creature. If there's some reason why you can't put the counters on, the power, toughness, and type changing effects all still happen because those are separate, independent effects of this spell. With Cyber Conversion, there's only one step. You turn the targeted creature face down. Being that it's face down, the game needs to know some values for its characteristics, and rather than just relying on the game to supply the default values, Cyber Conversion specifies what those values will be as part of the same effect that turns it face down. And this is also why Cyber Conversion has a different template from Lifecraft Awakening, avoiding the use of the word becomes. Double-faced cards, melded permanents, and face-down cards that are part of a mutate stack cannot be turned face down, and so the rules governing those cards were all modified to include a line clarifying that their characteristics do not change if they're targeted with such an effect. There's actually one more class of cards that cannot be turned face down, and that class is cards that are already face down. The rule that says this already had the bit about how their characteristics are not changed, but actually this rule did have a minor change. Can you guess what it is? No? Well, maybe it'll help if I put the old version on screen so you can compare side by side. That's right. One of the instances of face down in the old rule was incorrectly hyphenated. You see, in Magic templating, face down is hyphenated when it refers to the specific object's state of being face up or face down. But when the text refers to the action of turning a permanent face up or face down, that is not hyphenated. Now, I personally don't see how anyone could have ever got these mixed up, but it's fixed now, so I guess my heart can rest. And that is all the changes in the CR. It's pretty straightforward this time. None of the mechanics are radically different from what we had before, and most of the changes are minor edits. Since the rules team has the time to get into the weeds with stuff like this, I'll close out with one of my own personal requests from my wish list. I would love it if WotC would make the distinction between modal and non-modal double-faced cards more clear. Ever since the rules changed in the Spider-Man set to allow modal double-faced cards to transform, there's been exactly one difference between modal and non-modal double-faced cards, that being the inability to play the back face of non-modal DFCs. So yes, there is still a very significant gameplay difference between those two types of cards. So let me ask you something. How do you know whether something is a modal DFC or a non-modal double-faced card? Pause the video now to think about why it's legal to play Soporific Springs from your hand but not Primal Wellspring. And by the way, the answer isn't the reminder text that says transforms from Primal Amulet because, like I said before, italicized text has no game significance. In any case, modal double-faced cards can transform now. So, how would you know this isn't just one of those modal DFCs that has an ability that lets you transform it? Now, the answer is the DFC symbol at the top. This one is specifically tied to modal DFCs, so if you don't see this symbol at the top, you cannot play the back face. Fortunately, Wizards has only ever used one symbol on modal DFCs. In contrast, there have been lots of symbols used for non-modal DFCs throughout the years. Now, I think it's pretty unrealistic to expect that players would somehow be able to tell that the black triangle on a light background is the one special symbol that has an actual gameplay meaning, nor that anyone who didn't already know this tidbit would be able to tell that that's what the gameplay meaning is. In my ideal world, WotC would abolish the distinction between modal and non-modal DFCs altogether, and enforce the inability to play the backside of certain DFCs by mass errating all of them to have a new keyword that means this side can't be played, or else by formally endowing the DFC symbol with the appropriate rules meaning, similar to a color indicator. I think this would be the cleanest solution, even if it would require a large update and entail some minor functional changes. The ability to unify both types of DFCs under a single umbrella would greatly simplify that section of the CR too. For a possibly more realistic scenario, I'd like to at least see the DFC symbol, front face versus back face, and modal versus non-modal, be incorporated into the card's oracle text. Being able to look up somewhere and unambiguously see that something is or is not modal would be a big step up. Unfortunately, I can't think of a way to rework the symbols such that their game significance is a little bit more apparent, and even if that was possible, I'm not sure that changing what they look like once again would have a net negative in terms of the confusion, which is of course the ultimate goal for such a project. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.